in our region. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler. I'm the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, AP4D, a relatively new organisation that focuses on how Australia can use all tools of statecraft to try to influence the world we live in. And we spend a lot of our time thinking about the deep issues that we're going to cover today. I'm joining you today from the land of the I'm in Sydney. I just arrived in Sydney this morning, the land of the Gadigal people. I note that this week is NAIDOC week, and it marks, I think, 50 years of celebration of Indigenous voices and culture. So if you haven't got involved, please do look at the events that are on and use this moment to engage with Australia's Indigenous culture and resilience. Now, on our topic tonight, abandoning our fears, finding peace and security in our region, I can hear two echoes there. Okay, one is finding peace and security in our region. Famously, Paul Keating talked about Australia finding its security in Asia rather than from Asia. So there's that I think we'll be covering. The other idea in there is the idea of abandonment. And I was privileged enough to work for many years with Alan Gyngell, late Alan Gyngell, at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And his famous book, Fear of Abandonment, traces that fear as a key part of a motivation for Australian foreign policy since our beginning. I think the cleverness of our title is the idea that instead of the fear controlling us, we can abandon that fear and choose a different future. So to help us on this topic tonight, we have truly extraordinary people. The Honourable Gareth Evans, AC, and Professor Kishore Mahbubani. I'm not going to go through all of their achievements. I am certain you are on this call precisely because you are aware of all of their achievements. What I would say is, I think one of the things I admire most about both of them is that they are practitioners who have, without doubt, had an impact on events in the world, but they're also authors and thinkers who have had an impact on how we conceptualize and think about the world we're in. And both those things seem to me very precious. So to kick us off, I'm going to call upon Gareth, if I can say from here on. And I think you're going to talk to us a bit about the situation we find ourselves in and perhaps what this moment might demand of us.
Well, thanks, Melissa, for that very generous introduction. And it's a pleasure, as always, to join my old friend and colleague, Kishore, on this occasion. Last weekend, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made a speech which sections of the Australian media, the defence and security establishment, and the leadership of the coalition opposition found shockingly provocative. He went so far in delivering the John Curtin oration as to insist that we were an independent country in which we think and act for ourselves, follow our own course and shape our own future, speak for ourselves as a sovereign nation, resist our security being outsourced, and need an Australian foreign policy anchored in strategic reality, not bound by tradition. Well, that was too much for the Murdoch presses, Greg Sheridan, for whom this was a bizarre look away from America speech, which would diminish, if not undermine, the US-Australia alliance, and has lost sight of what our enduring national interests at play here are. For strategic analysis, Peter Jennings, Albanese was appeasing China and antagonising the US. And for opposition leader Susan Lee, with the 9 newspapers pressing her to fan the flames, quoting again, "Now is a time to build our influence in Washington, not diminish it. And many Australians will wonder whether this speech at this time is in our national interest." Well, my own instinct, on the contrary, is that this was a speech which the overwhelming majority of Australians will warmly embrace. Australians are never very good at doing deference, and we have a particular distaste for overt sucking up We still cringe at the memory of Harold Holtz all the way with LBJ, and I think we collectively wince at the kind of daddy knows best language which was employed by NATO's leadership recently in order to keep Donald Trump on side. And unquestionably, of course, a big factor in Labor's recent landslide election was the widespread perception that the then opposition leader, Peter Dutton, was overdoing not only his affection for, but the grovel to Donald Trump's America, a country described with memorable succinctness recently by Harvard's Stephen Walt, no soft lefty, as Kishore will be well aware, as a country under its present leadership, and I quote, weaker, sicker, poorer, dumber, more indebted, less admired, more divided, and maybe no longer a genuine democracy. Tell us what you really think, Steve. A rather more legitimate concern in response to the Albanese speech, and one that I certainly feel, is that the Australian government is in fact not putting its defence and foreign policy money where the Prime Minister's mouth was. The reality is that we are militarily more enmeshed with the US than we've ever been, becoming even more so, and that our capacity for independent sovereign decision-making is becoming ever more at risk. There's the proposed AUKUS transfer to us, of course, by the United States, of super-sensitive nuclear propulsion technology, based in reality, that transfer, if not formal agreement, on the expectation clearly that the submarines in question will be, for all practical purposes, an extension of the American fleet, available at the click of a US presidential finger to support the United States in any military enterprise, however misguided or however much against our own national interest, in which it may choose to engage. There's the Stirling submarine port and the Henderson dry dock facility, both near Perth, and a possible further East Coast submarine base, all now freely available for US use. There's the Darwin Marine Base and the critically important B-52 base in Tyndall. All of this, in addition to the Pine Gap facility, which has been crucial forever for missile early warning and targeting, as well as general intelligence collection, has long been understood to be a likely early target if we're ever to be drawn into conflict alongside the United States. So the reality is we now have targets on our back right across the continent, all painted on the assumption that these American bases are insurance policies, that they're an insurance policy price worth paying for the protection that we'd be buying for the United States under the ANZUS alliance, and of course as a return for 100 years of mateship. And all also on the assumption that we face a real threat of military attack in the foreseeable future, maybe as early as 2027, from a formidable regional foe in the People's Republic of China. Now, it's my view that neither of these assumptions is well founded, and that Australian defence and security policy really does need to be refocused accordingly. What about the China threat, so-called? There's certainly much about China's recent behaviour to justify security concern in our region, including its international law-defying territorial ambition in and militarisation of the South China Sea. There's its repeatedly stated determination to unify Taiwan with the mainland by force, if necessary. There's its dramatically increasing military capability, including its nuclear arsenal. There's its manifest desire to resume its historical role of regional hegemon, to whom obeisance is due in Southeast Asia, and no doubt Kishore will have a bit more to say on that subject. There's its continued assertiveness on other territorial fronts with Japan and India, and there's its efforts to increase its presence and its influence in smaller but still strategically significant regional players like the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste. All that acknowledged, I don't believe that any of this remotely warrants fear, let alone panic. Much of the behaviour in question we're seeing from China is no more than can and should be expected of a hugely trade-dependent, not just regional, but now global economic superpower, resentful of any continuing claim by America to unchallenged primacy in regional and global affairs, and wanting to claim its own strategic space, and of course to generally reassert some of its historical greatness after more than a century of wounded national pride. There's no reason to assume that Taiwan apart, China would ever contemplate outright military aggression, Hitler, Tojo, or Putin style, against any of its regional neighbours, let alone the United States. And even in relation to Taiwan, the explanation which I repeatedly heard when I was in Beijing for the whole of last week for China's increasingly menacing air and naval activity around the island seems at least prima facie plausible, that it was all about deterring Taiwan's president, Lai Ching-te, from stepping over the Declaration of Independence line he seems increasingly inclined to straddle, and that it should not be seen as foreshadowing outright attack in any foreseeable future, which attack would only ever be prompted by such a Declaration of Independence. There's certainly not much for Australia to fear from the mere fact of China's regional assertiveness and military build-up. Not only has there never been any suggestion of Chinese designs on our own territory, but with Beijing actually closer geographically to London than to Sydney, physical invasion has always been wildly implausible logistically and will remain so. The Red Alert, Age and Sydney Morning front pages of March 2023, which all Australians will remember with their portrayal of Chinese fighter planes headed towards us, was really scaremongering of the most irresponsible kind. And I think it's also true of the angst that was generated by this year's cheeky but hardly very threatening circumnavigation of our continent by a small Chinese naval task force. What does pose a risk to us is a major war erupting between the US and China, which is certainly not inconceivable over Taiwan, and Australia joining in on the US side under pressure from Washington. Outright invasion of Australia might not be an option, but grey zone operations, blockade attempts, and hit and run attacks on particular facilities, the increasing number of major US military installations on Australian soil being obvious targets in this respect, certainly would be a plausible possibility. The crazy irony is that with AUKUS and its associated commitments, we're now spending eye-watering amounts of money to build a capability to meet military threats, which threats are only likely to arise because we're building that capability and using it to assist the United States. If sanity does not prevail and war does erupt, this is not a fight that it would make any sense for Australia to join. While obviously we should and would deplore any attack on a flourishing democracy, as Taiwan obviously is, the reality is that Taiwan has always been a rather special case, certainly not enjoying the same kind of universally recognised sovereignty as Kuwait or Ukraine. Our involvement in a war in its defence would make almost zero military difference, but come at vast cost to us, above all, of course, economically, with the overnight severance of all links with our major trading partner that this would obviously entail. So what about the American insurance policy? The stark reality is that what we've long thought to be buying an insurance policy through our alliance involvement with the United States, and which we're now proposing to take to dramatic new levels with the AUKUS submarine project and all the basing side deals that go with it, simply can't be relied upon, if indeed it ever could. Whatever the psychological comfort it might have offered us in days gone by, the ANZUS Treaty has never legally bound the United States to defend us, even in the event of existential attack. Washington will no doubt shake a deterrent fist and threaten and deliver retaliation if its own assets on Australian soil are threatened or attacked, but that's as far as our expectations should extend. And the notion that extended nuclear deterrence justifies our prostration that the US really would be prepared to sacrifice San Francisco for Sydney is and always has been a ludicrous delusion. Donald Trump's second-term presidency puts that conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. He sees allies as freeloading encumbrances rather than assets. He's no respect, obviously, for international law and institutions, has no instinct to push back against the excesses of authoritarian governments, and he thinks rather, to the extent that he thinks consistently or coherently at all, in terms of every major power, including Russia, China, and the United States itself, having within its own sphere of influence an unrestricted license to act as it pleases, politically and militarily, if not economically. And all that in the context of the United States no longer having, objectively, the comparative military power that it once had to impose its will on China and to perpetuate its leadership in our region. With its oft-proclaimed pivot to Asia, so far producing very little in the way of additional hard power projection. All this means that there's a fundamental need for Australia now to rethink and refocus our defence and foreign policy. I've argued at length elsewhere for this to be built around four guiding principles: less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, and more global engagement. I'll leave for another occasion the case for a more global engagement, including on issues not directly or immediately relevant to our security and prosperity. And in that context, our national interest, which I've long argued in being seen to be a good international citizen at a time when Trump's America has abandoned any claim to such decency. But as to the first three of my principles, less America, more Asia, more self-reliance, what, in bald summary, we haven't got much time, would they involve? Less America, for me, doesn't mean walking away from the ANZUS alliance, which has delivered, of course, important technical, logistic and intelligence support in the past and hopefully will continue to do so in the future. But it does mean recognising its limits for all the reasons that I've already mentioned, and it does mean our becoming far less dependent on it. Nor does less America mean, for me, welcoming an American retreat from our region, where it can continue to play, I think, an important balancing role, concentrating China's mind on the risks of overreach. But it does mean recognising, frankly, that the days of US primacy are over and adjusting our expectations accordingly. More self-reliance on the premise, of course, that defence planning must be based on potential adversaries' capabilities, not on assumptions, however reasonable, about their intent. This means we're going to have to get used to doing more, to spending significantly more, and prioritising that expenditure more wisely. As Prime Minister Albanese insists, it's not a matter of identifying a particular arbitrary percentage of GDP, but rather focusing on the capability that we most need. Scrapping the AUKUS submarine project, which is highly contestable on deliverability, cost benefit, and above all, loss of sovereign agency grounds, would, I think, create most of the necessary budget room for doing just that. In shaping our future capability, I think we should support not a continuation of the forward defence strategy we've more or less explicitly adopted in recent decades and into which the AUKUS submarines are obviously playing, but what Sam Roggeveen calls the echidna strategy, spiky but unthreatening, recognising that this particular echidna would need to be able to both fly and swim. Such a strategy would need to focus on making our adjacent skies and seas unsafe to the point of impenetrability for any opposing force through a combination of air, underwater, missile, and cyber detection and destruction capabilities, with very significant reliance on autonomous, uncrewed delivery systems. Finally, more Asia means Australia actively pursuing, as the present government is, to be fair, effectively, I think, doing, strengthened political and, where possible, military relationships on both a bilateral and on a multilateral basis with our key regional Asian neighbours, Japan, Korea, India, Southeast Asia, with whom we have obvious common interests. All of us have very strong economic relations with China. None of us really want to be forced to take sides in the China-US strategic contest. None of us want to be collateral damage if things go pear-shaped. But equally, we all have an interest in ensuring that China does not overreach and in concentrating Beijing's mind on the prospect that overdoing its hegemonic aspirations in the region will be met with serious pushback, not just individually, but collectively. More Asia also means for me Australia trying to develop with China itself not just a one-dimensional economic relationship, but a much more multi-dimensional one, particularly in the multilateral sphere, where we should be actively exploring the scope for cooperation on a whole range of regional and global public policy, public goods issues, from climate change to nuclear arms control, from terrorism to health pandemics, from peacekeeping to responding to mass atrocity crimes, and defending free trade. To do so would be entirely consistent with the mantra which we've often heard repeated from Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Wong, that in dealing with Beijing, we should cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and manage our differences wisely. Well, keeping our balance as we walk this tightrope between China and the United States is not an enterprise for the diplomatically or politically faint-hearted. The stakes could hardly be higher. But if we stay calm, keeping our heads when all too many around us seem to be in danger of losing theirs, and recognising that by far the best way of achieving national security is always cooperatively finding that security with others rather than against them, then there's every chance that we can succeed. Thanks for that, and I look forward to joining the discussion.
Thank you, Gareth. I think that is claps all around. Thank you for sharing. I'm very conscious that Gareth has only just returned back from a trip to China and has turned that round very quickly for us. I can see some questions are already coming in, so I do encourage people to do that. I can also see Annette is reminding that as we've already started talking about AUKUS, that there's a meeting on Sunday, and you can see the information and the speakers there in chat. So I will now turn to Kishore, if I may. I am pretty much certain and very much looking forward to whatever bracing advice you would like to give us.
I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you. I'll try to make it less bracing, Melissa. Let me just begin by saying that I want to emphasize that I'm a Singapore citizen. I'm not an Australian. I don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of Australia, but nonetheless, I consider myself a friend of Australia. And sometimes it's interesting how your friends can see your dilemmas better than you can see yourself. In fact, Farid Zakaria, when he gave me an endorsement for one of my books, says it takes our friends from overseas to tell us sometimes what we fail to see. And here I would say I'm broadly sympathetic with the points that have already been made by Gareth. But if I had to make one point even more sharply than what Gareth has, is that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that about 10 to 15 years from now, Australia, if it carries on with its current policies, is going to sail into a fog of geopolitical insecurity. And there's no question in my mind that Australia will feel more insecure 10 to 15 years from now, again, if it carries on with its present policies. and doesn't change course. Now, unlike Gareth, who's much younger and more vigorous than me, I've not prepared a text, but I want to tell my Australian friends that I have consistently made some of these arguments over the years. In 2012, I believe I went to Australian National University and gave a lecture on Australia's destiny in the Asian century, pain or no pain. I think, Gareth, you were there.
Yeah.
This is available on the ANU website. Again, I point out to some of the structural changes I'm going to talk about. And at the same time, in the Australian Foreign Affairs, I came out with an article on Australia's choice. Can it be a bridge to Asia? So I have published several articles. So what I'm going to say is consistent with what I've said before. And yet, here the first point, there are 3 points I'm going to make, by the way, about why I believe that Australia will feel more insecure. One is, of course, the fact that we are witnessing a once in a 200 years change in sort of the structure of power around the world, with number one, the decline of the West, relative decline of the West. The West still remains very strong and powerful, by the way, but relatively it's in decline very clearly. And the second point, of course, you're seeing the return of Asia. And the third reason I'm going to point out is that Australia needs to develop at some point in time some kind of bipartisan long-term consistency in its geopolitical policies that has got to transcend these changes of government, because in the long run, the geopolitical threats don't change just because your governments change. So these are my 3 points for why Australia will feel insecure. Now, on the first point, on the relative decline of the West, the country that will feel it the most acutely by far is Australia. And for the simple reason that, to put it simply so that my Australian friends can understand, if Australia was located where Canada is, the decline of the West, the rise of Asia become irrelevant to you, right? Because geopolitics at the end of the day is about geography. Canada is situated in North America. Australia will be a Western outpost in Asia. And there is no question that Western power is going to recede from Asia. Absolutely no question, right? Which is why, by the way, sort of, there's been mention of AUKUS, of course, and not surprisingly. Everybody finds it rather strange that you're turning to the UK as a potential friend or ally to defend you. I mean, the UK has failed this region, right? In World War II, it promised to defend Singapore and disappeared. And then it promised to keep its naval bases in Singapore and disappeared. And just yesterday, Martin Wolf had a column in the Financial Times. I don't have it in front of me, but if I remember correctly, what Martin Wolf said in the first paragraph, Australia has a failed economy, a failed political system, and I think a failed public service or something. Three massive failures. Here you have a country that is struggling, frankly, really struggling to adapt to the new world. And Australia is saying, come and defend me. That's very strange. And I don't know why no one's pointed that out. But that's just one example. But clearly, Western power is going to recede. Now, of course, America is going to remain as a major power, no question. The question is, of course, is how it will play its role in this region. And many of us, including Singapore and Australia, want the US to remain in this region, want the US to play a constructive role. But at the same time, as we know, we're now dealing with a different United States. And I want to emphasize that it would be a mistake to think that all the turmoil we are facing is just because we have one erratic individual called Donald Trump. Once he goes away, hooray, we'll be back. We'll go back to the good old days. You can trust the United States and everything will be fine. I think we should consider the possibility that Donald Trump the story is not about one individual. It's about a structural change in the United States of a population that says, take care of me first. Make America great again. Rest of the world, you go take care of yourself. So what Donald Trump is capturing and that's why he remains popular, is a zeitgeist of America, which says, come home, take care of our things. And any United States that says, my job is to make America great again, is not going to be an America that says, I'm going to prioritize the rest of the world. And incidentally, I'm sure we are all still reeling from all this information on these tariffs and so on and so forth. But just imagine if you're Japanese or you're South Korean. If the United States is not prepared to sacrifice some of its economic interests to help Japan and South Korea, you mean the United States will sacrifice its cities to defend Japan and South Korea? Don't you already got to start thinking differently now? It's a different world, right? And see, this is what's missing in the Australian discourse. An absolute failure to recognize that the world that you lived in so comfortably has changed fundamentally. It's not about individuals. It's about some seismic change that is happening. And so the role and influence of the West is going to diminish, for sure. And since Australia will remain a Western outpost in Asia, it will feel isolated psychologically in this different era. So this leads me to a second point about the return of Asia. And here too, while everybody sort of in principle acknowledges that Asia is rising, changing and everything, psychologically it still hasn't been driven in yet. And I'll give you one simple example. And this is from, of course, a very sophisticated continent, Europe. Many Europeans, you can see, leaders, Kaja Kallas, Elizabeth von der Leyen, still give lectures to China, make condescending remarks about China. China, why don't you improve yourself? But the Europeans don't realize one simple fact. In 1980, the combined GNP of Europe was 10 times bigger than China. 1980, 10 times bigger. Today, they are about the same size. By 2050, Europe will be half the size of China. When you go from being 10 times bigger to becoming half the size of China in one lifetime, please acknowledge it. Stop speaking condescendingly towards China. Stop telling the Chinese you should do X, Y, and Z. I mean, the era when you could speak condescendingly to Asian countries is over. Absolutely over. But many in the West have not grasped it, right? And here, your problem for Australia is, by association, you're affiliated with those sorts of statements. And here, the main point I want to make about the return of Asia is that there's no question that Australia is well integrated into the region in terms of government-to-government relations, economic ties with Asia and all that. And Australia is welcomed on all the Asian forums and so on and so forth. All that's true. But at the same time, if it's going to be the Asian century, it's not just about your formal ties, your diplomatic links, your treaties. It's about developing a deep, organic understanding of how Asian minds work and how Asians interact, right? And how Asians deal with each other. And that's going to be a bit of a shock for a country where most of its population doesn't speak any Asian language, and is actually learning less Asian languages rather than more Asian languages. Even Bahasa, I'm told, study of Bahasa is going down. Now, I mean, by the way, I've observed Gareth. He's a brilliant diplomat. He knows how to play this ASEAN games very well and understands the depths very well. But there are not many Australians, as you know, like Gareth, who adapt to this environment. And in that sense, what Australia may need is some degree of psychological adaptation to an Asian environment and how Asians view things. And it is at the same time, to make the picture even more complicated, Asia itself is changing, adapting, evolving. It's not stagnant, right? I mean, if you look at the ASEAN countries, for example, clearly, let's say 20, 30 years ago, their relations with the United States were much closer than their relations with China. And they still want to preserve these close relations with the United States. But at the same time, they cannot deny that the geopolitical picture has changed. And so they want to have equally good ties with the United States and with China. That's been a shift, a significant shift. And they won't take sides in this contest. Very, very clearly, they won't take sides. And, you know, this is where I think the one worry I have for Australia is that Australia doesn't understand how significant the Taiwan issue is to China. If there's one issue on which China will go to war with, is Taiwan. So if you get submarines that may be used directly or indirectly on Taiwan, it is in effect a declaration of war on China. And I don't understand why you want to do that, but that's something that you got to consider whether that's in your interests. Again, but that's a debate for Australians. But the final point I'll make is that as the geopolitical environment for Australia becomes more challenging, it would be good for Australia to develop a kind of bipartisan consistency in its policies and sticks with that consistency regardless of whichever government is in office. Because at the end of the day, the geopolitical realities are not going to change when governments change. And here, if you look at Southeast Asia, for example, I mean, as I explained, Southeast Asia is complex. I sometimes tell my Filipino friends, I tell them, you know, if you're going to live with a neighbor like China, you can't switch from Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, pro-China, to Aquino, pro-US, to Duterte, pro-China, to Marcos, pro-US. You know, at the end of the day, that's not good for Filipino interests. Whereas by contrast, a country that has to deal with China in a much more painful fashion, by the way, because they live with China for 2,000 years now, is Vietnam. But the amount of strategic discipline that the Vietnamese have when it comes to dealing with China is amazing. And that's why the Vietnamese say to become a leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China and you must be able to get along with China. If you can't do both, you cannot become a leader of Vietnam. And I would say for future leaders of Australia, you must be able to stand up to China, but you must also be able to get along with China. And if you can't do both, you can't possibly help Australia. Thank you.
Again, huge thanks, Kishore. Well, people are already coming in with responses. I think I might start with that idea you were talking about, Kishore, about the world we live in is changing and how vital our understanding of Asia is. I think looking at the group of people we have here today, I think these are people who very early on realized that the world was changing and very early on realized that we needed to have a greater understanding of our region. What's been interesting is the way that sort of adaptation has been coming across society. Some people have made that adaptation and have been advocates, and others have not yet made it. So I'm interested for both of you, you know, what would you say in terms of that psychological adaptation you have to move beyond if you've always, as Australia has, strong Western maritime power as our great and powerful friend? We've got to adapt how we do it. So, Gareth, can I start with you on that?
Sorry, you were just breaking up there. I mean,
Oh, I
managing the
apologise. So
No,
we
that's all
had
right.
a question from Annette talking
No,
about that sort of embedded psychological side and that adaptation we need.
well, managing that psychological adaptation that's the nature of the game, actually. I mean, one thing that is going to help is ever increasing Asian Australian population. We've got 1.5 million nearly Chinese Australians, nearly 6% of our community already, many other Asian Australians, and that is bound over time to make a difference. But there are entrenched attitudes which are very hard to change, and we're all acutely conscious of that. I don't think there's any simple tricks here that anyone can immediately utilize. I mean, it's the language teaching thing, the cultural acclimatization that's associated with language teaching is critical. And as Kishore says, that's unhappily going backwards. One of the reasons for that is so many Australians find themselves now in the same classes as first language speakers and feel that it's just too hard to compete against them. And so they go out the door rather than increasing the numbers that we desperately need. From one point of view, that's no great tragedy so long as we have so many Asian Australians that can themselves be at the cutting edge of our relationship with the region. But it is pretty catastrophic in terms of the shortfall in cultural understanding that really does come and really only comes with the sort of exposure to another culture that's involved in learning his language. So all of that's pretty depressing. I mean, I think the critical element also that Kishore put his finger on is the absolute necessity for this relationship with the region to move beyond tawdry partisan consideration and become a matter of genuine bipartisan consistency and enterprise, with the language of our leaders reflecting the reality that Kishore admirably describes, and that hopefully filtering down into the wider community as part of the response that we need to make, and filtering also into our business community, which has been spectacularly incapable for the most part of taking advantage of the opportunities that are so visibly there in the region, and about which I've routinely despaired many times over the last 20, 30 years. So it's a tough call, but I mean, mindsets are critical. And this understanding that our future lies with our geography, not our history, that Asia really is what it's all about, and that we ignore that or misunderstand that at our peril. It just has to sort of penetrate the Australian psyche, and it has to start in the education system. It has to be accompanied by serious commitment and articulation by political leaders and other community leaders whose views are taken seriously. And it's something we just have to continue to work out and not accept with any degree of complacency the absence of it. But if Kishore has any ideas about how to operationalise his prescriptions for our cultural improvement, I would be delighted to hear them. I'm all ears, Kishore.
Thank you, Gareth. I have actually one concrete suggestion. You know, many Australians don't appreciate the fact that ASEAN is a geopolitical gift to Australia. At the end of the day, you have close to 700 million people living north of you. And Southeast Asia could easily, frankly, should have been a region. It's described as the Balkans of Asia. It's got far greater diversity of language, race, religion than any other region in the world, right? There are 700 million people, 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, communists. We have everything. This should have been a region in trouble, in turmoil, in ferment. Instead, it has become an oasis of peace and prosperity. And by the way, ASEAN's economic growth is stunning, okay? In the year 2000, and I'm going to compare EU and China before, Japan was 8 times bigger than ASEAN in the year 2000. Now Japan is 1.1, 1.2 times bigger than ASEAN, and ASEAN will be bigger than Japan by 2030. Okay, so you are blessed to have an oasis of peace and prosperity right north of you, and not Syria or Libya or Iraq or Iran or whatever north of you, and you take it for granted. And that's an absolute mistake. Absolute mistake. You should actually show tremendous respect towards ASEAN and frankly cherish ASEAN. Because without ASEAN, psychologically, you'll be living in a much more troubled world than you are today. ASEAN gives you the oxygen, right? The peace around your neighborhood. And by the way, and that wasn't achieved easily, okay? It wasn't achieved easily. It took extraordinary effort on the part of some remarkable ASEAN leaders. And here we are today, and you are a beneficiary of it. But I can tell you that I've heard Australians speak about ASEAN so dismissively, so condescendingly, because all that you read about ASEAN is from the Anglo-Saxon media, from The Economist, from the Financial Times, that runs down, New York Times, run down ASEAN. And you don't even pause and say, hey, hang on a second. Is it in my interest to run down ASEAN? Is that going to help Australia's interests? Would you like to see the destruction of ASEAN? Would that be better for Australia? Or do you want to see the opposite? And if your population is not even aware that ASEAN has given you a geopolitical gift, then something is wrong. Clearly, there's a lack of awareness of where you are situated geographically. Mm-hmm. And that's the one fundamental change that's got to happen. And yeah, I just want to mention in passing. I mean, Australia can join the Quad. Of course, it has a right to do so. It should continue to do so. But people can also observe where you give your priority. Mm-hmm. What gets more attention. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a mistake not to give greater priority to ASEAN.
Mm. I've been lucky enough to come to the Australia ASEAN special summits, and I think a lot of attention is being paid in a number of parts of society. The question is, how do we get more people involved and more people to understand? Now, you have 2 tricky questions, may I say, from our audience. One is on ASEAN and military men in the region, human rights issues. Another one is on what should Australia's role be in the South China Sea. Would you like to tackle either of those?
Sure. I appreciate challenging questions. Firstly, on human rights, right? And I'm glad the subject of human rights was brought up, because that's basically when Western countries bring up human rights, all that the Asian countries see is a political weapon that is used selectively to criticize those whom you want to destroy politically and do nothing when it hurts you personally. You never respect any judge who would say both of whom committed murders and one goes to jail and the other just gets scot-free, right? The justice is supposed to be blind, human rights is supposed to be blind. So they see Western countries will lecture, let's say China on Xinjiang, right? And then when Gaza comes up, what does Europe say? What is Europe saying about Gaza? And when the Asians see this, so I can tell you, when a Westerner brings up human rights, they are the subject of deep scorn from Asians. And I keep saying that the time when you could lecture Asians is over. Any Asian can expose Western double standards on human rights almost immediately. And so I would say for Australia to join the rest of the West in raising human rights issues, you will end up damaging your own position. And here, by the way, one small practical thing that Australia may want to pay attention to: watch your voting positions in the United Nations General Assembly. And you'll find there's a certain convergence in the way that Asian countries vote, and there's a convergence in the way that Western countries vote. And here, the most painful decision that Australia will have to make in practical terms is when it comes to making decisions to vote in the UN, which at the end of the day, by the way, are geopolitical decisions. Are you going to put your values first or your interests first? And I can tell you, most countries will put their interests first. Now, the second question on the South China Sea.
Yeah.
And, certainly 4 ASEAN countries have problems with China on South China Sea. But it's interesting, of the 4 countries, you only read about one in the papers, Philippines. And the interesting thing about Philippines is that right now you have a problem situation. When there's a change of government and then another president takes over, suddenly the problem disappears, right? And and by the way, in my book, Has China Won?, I point out, incidentally, that Stapleton Roy, a former American ambassador, told me that when Xi Jinping offered Barack Obama the opportunity to demilitarize the South China Sea, Obama should have accepted it right away. He didn't. Instead, the US stepped up naval patrols. So from the Chinese point of view, this is documented, by the way. I offered to demilitarize, you turn me down. You want to militarize it? Okay, I'll militarize it too. So the South China Sea issue is an issue that is used by others for their own political gains. And that's something that you got to understand too.
Kishore,
Right.
you are being outrageous on multiple fronts. South China Sea involves manifest and obvious breaches of international law of the sea, not only in the scope of the territorial claims, the 9-dash line and all the rest of it, but in the militarization of those reefs and islets. You know that perfectly well. China knows that perfectly well. Everybody knows it perfectly well. There's heaps of hypocrisy, of course, in the US posturing about this when it's itself in breach of so many international rules and guidelines and treaties. But nonetheless, that's the reality. And China's been incredibly dragging its feet on the Code of Conduct and Declaration of Principles and so on. ASEAN, for all its many, many attractions, which you perfectly articulated before, has been unable to give any effective collective pushback against that, with Cambodia and Laos being effectively wholly owned subsidiaries of Beijing. And South China Sea is not the happy story that you are painting. It's not a source of panic or fear. I agree. We can totally overstate the neurosis about that. But there's certainly an issue there to be confronted, and you can't just dismiss it. Similarly, on human rights, I mean, Western values are, irritating beyond belief, claims of Western values. What we're talking about here are universal values which you and everybody else in Asia and Africa, Latin America signed up to in the Universal Declaration, and which are manifestly under challenge in all sorts of places. I mean, Singapore is a very comfortable authoritarian society. It's not a fully fledged democracy. And there is something to be said, not just in Western terms, but in universal terms, for having genuine opportunities for dissent and kind of openness that has really been very, very difficult to sustain in Singapore. Impossible to sustain in Hong Kong, and that's been another tragedy, I think, not least for the resolution of the Taiwan question, because who in Taiwan would ever believe in the possibility of a 2 systems within a 1 China after what's happened in Taiwan and in Hong Kong with the democracy movement? I agree there's been grotesque overstatement in all sorts of contexts, and Xinjiang, I think, is one of them. But, you can't just say that human rights are nobody else's business. there are universal values involved here. Our common humanity demands a bit more respect than has been on offer from many, many people in the Asian firmament. And I think, really you've got to be a bit more accommodating on that front and not just make the assumption that there are two different value systems here which are irreconcilable. And one more thing on ASEAN. I mean, I totally agree that the gigantic achievement of ASEAN is as a conflict prevention mechanism in exactly the same way as the European Union has been. And, France, Germany is no longer thinkable there's been any conflict between them. And the removal of the thinkability of conflict among ASEAN members is a magnificent achievement. But where the hell have you been on Myanmar, which has been, in any view, a human rights catastrophe, a human catastrophe, and a catastrophe, not a catastrophe, but a serious diminution in the credibility of ASEAN because of its utter inability to get its collective act together and put any systematic pressure on what has been a very, very unpalatable and unhappy regime. So I think, you can't, I love what you say about all sorts of things, Kishore, but you really do push my limits a little bit on this stuff. And as you know, you always have, because we've had this argument many, many times.
Yeah, let me. I'm sorry, I have to respond briefly. I'll respond very quickly.
I'm not sure though, because there won't be time for anything else, Kishore.
Sorry, Kishore's got to reply.
I have to respond to these 3 points.
Of course he has to respond.
Very quickly. On South China Sea, you're absolutely right. It is very messy. It is very difficult. The 9-dash line is indefensible. We've been slow to get the code of conduct going. But guess what? We make sure that there are no wars in the South China Sea. We take care of that. And incidentally, if you just for your information, there's no such thing as a benign great power. When the Canadians and the United States were discussing whether a passage north of Canada was international waters or domestic Canadian territory, the Canadians insisted it was domestic Canadian territory, and the United States sent a warship. Problem settled. All great powers will assert their power. And if you're a neighbor of a great power, you must with great wisdom manage it in such a way that you defend your interests without locking yourself into a confrontational position. And that's the genius of ASEAN, Gareth. Get it? Point number 2 on human rights. My advice to you is post-Gaza, no Western mouth should use the word human rights anymore. If you walk into a room of Muslims and you tell them that you're defending universal values by defending Gaza, they will look at you and say, where did this man come from? If you really believe in universal human rights, the first people you need to rescue today is to go into Gaza and to save those children, save the mothers, save the families. And if you can't do that, please shut up on human rights.
Kishore, I think many of the people on the call would agree with you very much in terms of the issues in Gaza. Perhaps we might also care about Myanmar, and it's possible to care about both.
Yeah. No, I don't want to make it confrontational because Myanmar is definitely a challenge. But I can tell you that a problem like Myanmar cannot be solved overnight. It has to be managed. And what we've tried to do, I can tell you when Ali Alatas, a good friend of Gareth and mine, was asked, why did you bring Myanmar into ASEAN? Ali Alatas said, if we don't bring Myanmar into ASEAN, Myanmar will become a bone of contention between China and India, both of whom claim to have influence down there. Then we have a geopolitical rivalry right in our neighborhood. Let's bring Myanmar in and deal with it. And it's a pity. The tragedy is that this tragedy could have been avoided. Just to be very clear, the military should be condemned for what they did, no question. But if only Aung San Suu Kyi had just been slightly more flexible
Oh, I agree with that. I
And
agree
you
with
know,
that.
if only she had been slightly more flexible, we could have avoided this catastrophe. You know, so but nonetheless, we are behind the scenes, and what we're trying to do is you cannot solve it overnight, but at least we'd avoid a major failed state in our neighborhood. That's what we're trying to do. And by the way, having it within ASEAN does on a daily basis apply peer pressure on the Myanmar to at least observe certain levels of decency in what they're doing. Gently, slowly, we're trying to do it. But it'll take us 10 years, 15 years, but we'll work on it. But overall, if you look at problem countries around the world, compare Myanmar with other problem countries, with Sudan, with Syria and others, and see which one is doing better.
Now, one of the things we've started discussing has come up in the questions, which is around what do we expect China's character as a great power to be? So thank you to David Perkins who's put that in. Kishore, would you like to talk a little bit about that? How you expect China to behave as a great power and how you think we should be preparing for that?
Let me repeat my statement. There is no such thing as a benign great power. It's an oxymoron. China will behave like all great powers behave. It will exert its interests ferociously. Let there be no doubt about it at all, right? Right now, it is very carefully taking a low profile because it's under pressure from the United States. The pressure is real. But trust me, they're becoming stronger, and they're waiting, and they're patient in what they do. And so what we need to do in this moment now is to try and persuade the rest of the world to try and work out a common set of rules which will bind China and bind everybody else when China emerges as the number one power. This is why this moment in history is very, very important. Because I tell my American friends that every loophole you create in international law today is a loophole that China is going to walk through tomorrow. So when Donald Trump says Canada can become the 51st state of United States, hey, can Mongolia become a province of China? It was. And he says that, oh, Greenland should be part of the United States of America. It's closer to United States than to Denmark. Mm-hmm. Well, who's closer? Is Australia closer to United States or closer to China? Does geography matter?
Right. I think Gareth will come on this. I mean, one way of seeing it.
So the point is that at this moment of history, as China is emerging as the great power, now is the time to work with them to agree on a set of rules on what they'll be like when they become number one. But once they become number one, then if you try and persuade them, it's too late. So that's why we are patient.
Yeah, that's
slow.
Going to go to Gareth on that one.
Yeah, well, I agree completely with what Kishore was saying about that. What I found intriguing in Beijing last week is that when I said to a number of interlocutors in both the academic community and among some of the officials that Donald Trump is just a gift that goes on giving to you guys at the moment, why are you not taking more obvious advantage of it to be out there as the global superstar in defense of free trade, the global superstar in defense of multilateral institutions and the UN, the global superstar in defense of development assistance and aid in an environment where the US has so obviously retreated on all those fronts. And I was struck by the extreme caution with which these challenges were met by all my interlocutors. They're saying, this is not really where our national head is at the moment, occupying this sort of global leadership space. We're utterly preoccupied with our domestic economic environment. We're certainly preoccupied with the economic confrontation with the United States at the moment. And we're, preoccupied with a few other things, but we're just a bit reluctant to go that extra step. So the environment is a really optimal one for, as Kishore says, a serious effort by key players around the world to negotiate a new set of rules and conduct of multilateral institutions and processes that recognize the new tectonic plate shifts, the new changing geopolitical reality, that give China much more opportunity to be a rule maker, not just a rule taker in the construction of global institutions, and just get a set of ground rules that will work effectively for everybody. And I mean, the United States has a crucial role to play in this respect, and it's obviously completely gone missing with the Trump administration, which makes any attempt to move forward in these domains very, very difficult. Another such crucial domain, by the way, is nuclear arms control, where China is displaying no interest whatsoever at the moment in participating in any ongoing efforts at nuclear risk reduction, focusing almost entirely now in a way which wasn't previously the case on developing its nuclear parity before it's in terms of weapons numbers and so on. So the scope is there if only the right mindset can be brought to bear. And the right mindset is, and I've constantly quoted it over the years because it still strikes me as incredibly powerful. It's something I heard Bill Clinton say in 2002, 2 years after he left the presidency, and with all the wisdom of leaving high office brings with it. And he said at a function I was at with him in California, that America's got two choices about the way in which we use this great and extraordinary military and economic power that we have. Choice number one is to try to use it to stay top dog on the global block in perpetuity. Choice number two, and this is exactly what he said, is to use that great and unrivaled power to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global block. And I thought that was just pitch perfect. And it's something that Clinton never ever said remotely as explicitly in any subsequent public speech. And it's something to this day that no senior American politician will ever be heard to say, however much many of them, of course, believe that that's the reality, because it's so politically unacceptable to be anything other than America first, primacy-driven exceptionalist.
Yeah.
But to create a world in which we'll be comfortable living when we're not the dominant force is exactly the kind of world that we should be trying to create with China now. And I think there's a sufficient receptivity among the Chinese leadership to that sentiment to make it possible, if only it's reciprocated and effectively advanced by the other key players around the place, which unfortunately is not the case at the moment.
Listening to you both, I'm wondering if that particular moment has passed, if we are now at the point where the US is no longer that unquestioned top dog, and that rule building, which we would have liked to have done, needed to happen a long time before where we are now, given the way that the US is undermining the rules.
Well, no, I don't think. Well, Kishore, you come in, but I mean, I don't think so. From what I heard in Beijing, just a moment, I've just said a moment ago, there's not that degree of assertiveness that one would associate it with a top dog that now feels well and truly in command of the global bloc. That's not the case with the Chinese mindset, as I read it, at least at the moment. They are open and flexible, I think, about finding a new modus vivendi which reflects the reality of their superpower status and avoids all the humiliating nonsense of the institutional constraints and the rule taking that has afflicted the environment in the past. But I think if only the other players would come to the party. I mean, of course, Russia's another player in the game we haven't even talked about, and that's a really classic spoiler role at the moment in any significant advance on these fronts. But I've ceased to be the optimist, congenital, incorrigible optimist that I used to be and made the title of my memoir, but I'm not completely without optimism about the possibility of change. But what do you think, Kishore?
Yeah.
Well, I want to strongly endorse 2 points you made, Gareth, very, very strongly. The first point about the nuclear arms control regimes and so on and so forth. And here, I think it's important for us to preserve something very precious we have, which is that we live in a world without 25 nuclear powers, that we only have 9. And by the way, I have launched something called the Asian Peace Program, which last week came out with an essay by Sir Adam Thompson, a former British diplomat, pointing out in our Asian Peace Program that we have to try and work hard to preserve this nuclear regime that we have. It has mostly worked, by the way. And of course, we haven't had a nuclear war. And that's one area where the great powers can collaborate. Incidentally, for example, I can tell you, I was very happy to learn that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council have been having secret talks in Geneva on how to make sure that AI doesn't determine how nuclear weapons are used. That was a very positive development. Now, secondly, I'm so glad you mentioned the quote by Bill Clinton, because that's the quote I have in my book, The Great Convergence. Paul Kennedy shared it with me. He also heard it from Bill Clinton, but at a Yale conference. So he said it privately many places. But you're right, something which is so wise, such wise advice for the United States to use its power to create a set of rules that it can live with when it's number 2. I think that's what friends are for. And this is where, frankly, Australia and Singapore should, and others, work together to try and convince the United States that it is in the United States' long-term national interests to work in that direction. Of course, it cannot be done under President Trump because he doesn't believe in multilateralism. But, American presidents, as you know, changed quite dramatically. You can go from Obama to Trump. You can go back from Trump to Obama, for example. And the key point here is that what we're trying to advocate for the United States to do is something that would help the American people, and more importantly, help humanity at large too. Because right now, the one big thing that you said we haven't mentioned Russia. The other thing we haven't mentioned, equally importantly, is climate change. And climate change clearly is going to accelerate, right? The world is going to suffer. And this is stupid for us. Of all of us, 193 countries and 193 cabins on the same boat. Why do you care whether or not you have the bigger cabin or smaller cabin if the boat is sinking? You got to take care of the boat first. So I think issues like climate change, I believe, or pandemics should be forcing humanity to come together. And even though, Gareth, you say, you're no longer an incorrigible optimist, I continue to be optimistic over the fact that there are sound, fundamental reasons why humanity should continue cooperating.
Because there continue to be global problems we need to cooperate on. One question that was raised as an area where there's not a huge sign of cooperation, which is on technology and technology cooperation in the region. I'm interested in your take on that and how that's continuing to widen schisms. It's potentially an area where Australia can either be caught very badly between sort of 2 technology worlds, or the most optimistic would say perhaps we have a role in finding bridges between them. I'm interested in your take on that.
Well, I'll start, and then Gareth can. I must confess, technology is not a field I'm expert in, but I did publish an article in Foreign Policy magazine with the former president of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And our basic argument was that all efforts to throttle China's technological development have failed, right from the days of the Soviet Union denying China nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. The Chinese have always overcome technological blocks. And you can see recently, even in semiconductor chips, the head of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, has said, before the sanctions were applied, China was manufacturing 10% of its chips. After the sanctions were applied, China's manufacturing 50% of its chips. So the Chinese will race ahead. So at some point, again, going back to Bill Clinton's advice, it's better for the United States to work with China to arrive at a common set of standards on how you manage all these advanced technology, including AI, instead of trying to develop 2 completely different universes. And again, by the way, we are very much in the middle of this. The US-China struggle, incidentally, it's going to be a marathon struggle, right? Mm-hmm. We are still at the early stages. They're still feeling each other out, very much so. With the middle stage, both sides will get a better understanding of how strong both of them are. And then they get more realistic. And then you can think about how to, okay, now we know I cannot push you down. You cannot push me down. How do we compromise? That day hasn't come yet, but it's coming. At some point it'll come.
Well, I agree completely with Kishore that we've overdone the neurosis about the Chinese technological threat. And I mean, the semiconductor story is really an absolutely classic one. Biden introduces all these sanctions to try and stop the Chinese getting access to it. And within a few years, they've become, major players in that industry. And of course, the AI advances have been absolutely dramatic and breathtaking and have set the West back on its heels, recognizing just the extent of this Chinese capacity for achievement. So I think a lot of the continuing neurosis that we're now hearing in the Australian discourse about, you know, setting constraints on research cooperation on AI and IT stuff generally, because of the neurosis about risk that's potentially involved in that. I think we've just got to take a deep breath and walk away with that. I mean, the future of technology is going to be wholly in this space. China's going to be a major player, and the rest of us, if we're going to be players in the future, are going to have to work cooperatively with them. I mean, just the neurosis generally about Chinese influence. The Darwin port thing is my favourite example of just neurosis that's completely careered out of control. A 51% ownership interest of that port by a Chinese company is now generating a renewed bout of bipartisan angst and a determination to knock it off. I remember Dennis Richardson saying when this first happened, and Dennis is no lefty dove on these matters, that if you're worried about China learning about ship movements in and out of Darwin by virtue of its occupancy or ownership of the port, you'd learn more sitting on the fish and chip stand at the end of the wharf than you would through a 51% equity interest. And of course, if it ever did come to a conflict situation, there's all sorts of mechanisms that can be put in place to remove that potential adverse influence. So we've just got to get out of our heads the notion that there's an inevitable risk and inevitable confrontation, and just try to produce a cooperative mindset and work cooperatively for the resolution of problems on which we're all capable of making a contribution to their solution, including the big ones: climate change and pandemics and nukes, the big existential risks to life on this planet as we know it. This is the area of concern for the future, and to shut ourselves off from that kind of cooperation because of angst about potential misuse of capacity is to me just really overdoing it.
Well, can I continue on with that? We had a very good question from Mike Smith talking about, when we have a bipartisan position, but we think it's a misguided bipartisan position, how do we change that? And I think as the politician in the room, I'm going to ask you that one.
Well, I mean, you've just got to blow it up. I mean, that's what we. I mean, you've just got to have courageous voices within the party, within each of our parties, who bring to bear some serious analytical grunt, not just emotion, bring to bear some serious, identification of how our national interests would be better advanced by moving out of the intellectual traps in which we've built for ourselves, and just hope to God that the spark will ignite something. I mean, it's something a bit old-fashioned. It's called leadership. It means having people in charge of our respective political parties that are willing to be risk takers in breaking out of the mold if they can be persuaded intellectually that that mold is just not serving the national interest. The Hawke-Keating government was very, very good at doing that in multiple fronts. We've been rather less good at doing it, really, frankly, ever since. I'm very nostalgic, ridiculously so, perhaps, for that era. And it was a different era. There was a different environment in the immediate post-Cold War years, which we can all remember. There were a period of supreme optimism, which is not the case now. But it just does take a spirit of adventure to somehow, break the mold. And there's no mold that more obviously needs breaking at the moment than our dopey commitment to the AUKUS submarine project, I have to say. Maybe the Americans will make the decision for us in the next year or two or three, or maybe next day or two or three with the Colby Review. But this is a classic example of just being led by the nose down a completely blind alley, which is counterproductive to our own national interest.
Not thinking you're going to get much debate on that particular topic from our group today. But what I might do is I'd like to end up with a question that came from Bob Hill, um, who's looking at universities as a cultural and educational asset. And I'm conscious that both of you have very strong associations with universities. When we're talking about, at the topic we've had today, which is, rethinking and refocusing foreign policy, I'm really interested in what you see the role of universities as a national asset, as a part of statecraft, and perhaps as part of generating debate and understanding. So, Kishore, would you like to finish on that point?
Yeah. I mean, I believe universities have a very critical role to play.
Yeah.
And the good news about Asia is that, at one time, all the great universities were only in the West, as you know. In fact, until 20 years ago, very few Asian universities were in the top 10, top 100, whatever it is. Now there are more and more. In fact, I was shocked to see in one ranking, an American ranking of top 10 universities in what they call STEM.
Mhm.
9 were Chinese, 1 was American, Harvard.
Wow.
And I think within universities, you get basically communities of people who know how to talk to each other. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about university environment. And one thing good about university environment is you also learn to listen, which is a very important asset in life. And I do think that developing a network among the top universities in this region, Australia has got many great universities. We know that. So Australia, Southeast Asia, China, India, get universities together talking. That will make a huge difference, because then you can see some of the common challenges that we face. I mean, for example, take health, for example. There's so much we can do to improve the health of populations, for example, in Southeast Asia, quite often with minimal interventions. You don't require massive surgical intervention, whatever. Some small things can make a big difference. But that's why you can cooperate, and you got to find to try and build multilateral cooperation. Go for the low-hanging fruit. And one of the low-hanging fruit is getting universities to cooperate and collaborate with each other. And when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I joined 2 organizations, both, by the way, started in the United States. One was a Global Public Policy Network, and the other was the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, EPSIA. And you find that when you meet there and you talk down there in those settings, you can actually reach quite a bit of agreement with each other, and that can be the foundation upon which you then build a political understanding.
Well, what Kishore said is self-evidently true, and I completely agree with him. The point, however, does need to be made that if universities are to effectively perform this critical function, they really have to be allowed by their home governments to do just that and not be subject to censorship or control of the kind that Trump is obviously trying to do with the United States. But more worrying to me, in Beijing last week, I was there for nearly a week, and I had a lot of conversations with a lot of academics who I've known in the past who've been quite frank and fearless in the past in entering into the kind of discussions we're just talking about. They are now very nervously looking over their shoulder, very nervously worried about being watched, surveyed, reported upon, and very, very much more cautious than I can remember from years gone by in articulating, concerns they might have about, policy change that needs to be made. So it really is absolutely critical that we not be complacent about the need for that particular human right, if you like, of free expression, free intellectual association to take place. And there's a troubling backsliding going on at the moment. I hope it doesn't continue too long in China. These things do ebb and flow, and there's a bit of nervousness, which perhaps will evaporate over time in the current leadership. But it was troubling. Have you found that, Kishore, in your dealings with your fellow Chinese academics?
Yeah, I think I would agree that they are certainly more cautious nowadays. But there was a phase in the Hu Jintao period that was kind of unusual, where things were quite lax, and so now things are definitely much tighter. But what's interesting to me is that the biggest risk that the Chinese government is taking with its academics is that it's allowing both its young students to go and study in the West, and it is allowing its academics to go out and teach in the West and live in the West, right? And they could potentially be a source of trouble for them. And what's interesting is that when the United States decided to cut down the number of Chinese students, the Chinese government said, no, 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 we want you to take more. Right? And that to me is very interesting. As you know, the Soviet Union would never allow any young Soviet students to go and study anywhere in the world. And frankly, North Korea is not going to allow any students to go and study anywhere in the world. But the confidence that the Chinese have that we can share our best minds with the rest of the world and be confident that when they come back, they can deal with them, that to me is a sign that there is some degree of maturity in the Chinese system, you know.
Okay, well, look, I think we haven't had an amazing discussion. We weren't sure if we were going to try and finish it at 7 or at 7:30, and we had at least until 7:30's worth of discussion to have. So thank you so much to Gareth, to Kishore, and thank you for really throwing yourself into the discussions tonight. It takes energy, and we really appreciate that you brought that tonight. Thank you very much to ASPF for organising, and it's been a pleasure to see you all.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Kishore.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Maintain the rage.
You will.
I think this group will.
Okay. Cheers.